Alrighty, guys, so we are continuing on with period 9, and we are going to essentially wrap up Reagan's presidency in this video. I'm going to start with the two sort of only real scandals or moments of criticism during Reagan's presidency, and then we'll get into really the main thing that people think of when they think of Reagan, which is his Cold War efforts, and then the end of his presidency. So, like I said, the two main, I guess, during Reagan's, 8 years, the two biggest moments of, potential scandal or heavy criticism. The first is a foreign policy thing, and then the second is a domestic policy thing. So we'll start with the Iran Contra affair. So this is kind of a complicated thing, and I'll do my best to give you the abridged version. You don't need too many details, but I do want you to understand how this all happened and what exactly Reagan was accused of, and what we know went down. So a little background. I'll start with, I guess, in 1980, back in 1980 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Since then, we have been funding in larger and larger quantities, not only funding, but also arming anti-communist groups in the Middle East and in Central America. We had been doing so, Truman Doctrine and all of these things from before, but primarily in like Europe and Asia, but East Asia, but now we're getting into focus more in Central America, Latin America, and the Middle East. And like, for example, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we started arming the only anti-communist group in Afghanistan at the time, which was the Mujahideen. And what we didn't realize was that they were, or realized and didn't care, which is probably the more likely of the two scenarios, was that they are really a terrorist group, and eventually the Mujahideen evolved into the Taliban. So we were sort of funding and arming the Taliban for a few years, but we were okay with it because they were fighting the Soviet Union. Obviously, eventually they'll turn those arms on us and we'll have other problems to deal with, but that's just one example. Now, in Central America and Nicaragua in particular, we were funding a group that was actually from not Nicaragua, but they were from Honduras, called the Contras, and they were an anti-communist group fighting the Sandinistas. And the Sandinistas were in Nicaragua they were a socialist / communist group trying to overthrow the government and take over. And the Contras invaded to stop the Sandinistas from doing so. And of course, we are all gung-ho, we'll help anyone who's fighting communism. So the Contras are someone who we think we want to help. So ever since Reagan took office in 1981, his administration had been very enthusiastic supporters of the Contras and saying that he was going to make sure that the Sandinistas were not an issue by the time he was done in office. That meant funding and arming and training the Contras, which he, like I said, had been doing so since 1981, since he got into office. By 1985, after 4 years of that, Congress decided that we would no longer be funding the Contras. They passed a bill in the budget, or an amendment to the budget, that said, for the 1985 fiscal year and forward, we will not be using any CIA money, or really money at all, to fund the Contras. We're not going to be arming them anymore. We've done so for several years now. If they haven't made it work by now, who knows if they're gonna. We want to use this money for other things. So the Reagan administration was not happy about this, but there was not much they could do about it. Now, at the same time as that, on the other, this whole other separate scenario is our relationship with Iran. Not a great one. We know that we haven't really ever had a great relationship with Iran, but it got, significantly worse in the 1970s. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. But in 1982, we had just gotten our other hostages back. We got them back in 1981. And in 1982, a Iranian terrorist group in Lebanon took 7 Americans hostage. So we're right back in the middle of a hostage situation. So how can we get our hostages back? That's the question. We have this party line, this famous slogan of America, that we do not negotiate with terrorists. Well, So do we just leave our hostages over there? It was different when we were in the first Iranian hostage crisis, because we weren't trying to negotiate with necessarily terrorists. We were just trying to negotiate with the Iranian government. Now we are, Hezbollah is not the Iranian government. And so us negotiating with them to get these terrorists, or to get these terrorists back, to get these hostages back, an entirely different situation. And so, the question is like, what do we do here? And can we make it benefit us in other ways as well? If it's possible to help other people while also helping yourself, of course, that's something the U.S. government's going to be all over. So there's a lot of questions here as to what exactly Reagan's role was in this plan to get the hostages back, and what in general seems to be the realistic scenario is that Reagan most likely said to his administration and his advisors, get the hostages back. I don't care what you do, just get them back. And if there's something I don't need to know, don't tell me. Meaning, if you have to do some illegal stuff to get them back, I don't really care. Just keep me out of it so that my hands are clean. So it seems like he knew that something was going to happen that wasn't necessarily legal, but he didn't know what that thing was, which sort of kept him out of the dirt, so to speak. Here's what the plan ultimately was. Step 1, we're going to give weapons to Israel. Now, why Israel? Well, Israel's our friend. Israel's an ally of the United States. So it's not weird if we give weapons to them. We're giving weapons to so many different countries all of the time, still are. So, if we give weapons to an ally, no one's going to bat an eye at that. In addition, Israel is in the Middle East, right? Close to Iran and Lebanon and all these other places that we need to be negotiating with right now. Israel, we're going to give you these weapons, but we're also going to tell you what to do with them. We want you to sell these weapons to Hezbollah. So now we are funneling a weapon sale to an Iranian terrorist cell. Not a great look, but in exchange for the weapons sale, we will get our hostages back. Okay, we get the hostages. Now we've sold these weapons. Now why are we selling the weapons? Why wouldn't we just trade the weapons for the hostages? Well, we are selling them because we want this money. We'll take this money from this weapon sale and we will use it to fund the Contras, which we said we weren't going to do, but we don't have to take any extra money to do it because the money is now going to come from this weapon sale that no one's paying attention to because it has nothing to do with us. It's just between Israel and Hezbollah, and then Israel is going to take that money to fund the Contras. So in theory, we're just giving these weapons to Israel, and what they do with them is not our business. But seriously, we're telling them exactly what to do with them. We're telling them to sell them to a terrorist organization and then use that money to fund this other group that the government said we weren't allowed to fund anymore. So we do it, and we give the weapons to Israel. They get our hostages back. They sell the weapons to Hezbollah on 9 separate occasions. I might add 9 different weapon sales. It wasn't just like one big, here's a bunch of weapons. This happened 9 separate times. So we get our hostages back. They use the money to fund the Contras. Cool. Whole thing works. Well, a reporter for a Lebanese magazine caught wind of all of this and wrote about it in an expose in November of 1986. And that, our American media picked that up, and it wasn't long before Congress was like, hey man, we literally said you weren't allowed to do that. Not to mention it involved selling weapons to a terrorist group. So somebody's got to answer for this. This was not okay. And was the president involved? Now, the magazine expose and the investigation basically places a majority of the blame for the orchestration and the execution of this plan on an Army official named Oliver North. So Oliver North was, of course, fired by President Reagan from his position and brought in to testify during the hearings. And they do this huge investigation. And ultimately what they come up with is that the only real person that they can put, that the only real name they have in evidence against is Oliver North. They don't have any evidence to say that Reagan knew that this was specifically going to happen, or that he told anyone to sell weapons to Hezbollah, or that he told anyone to use money to fund the Contras illegally. So Reagan sort of, what I don't know can't hurt me policy worked in his favor here. It definitely felt really greasy to a lot of people, but there wasn't anything concrete enough to hurt Reagan in a real way. As for Oliver North, of course, he was arrested, convicted, sentenced to 3 years in prison and some community service. He did the community service, but he didn't end up having to do the prison sentence because his conviction later got overturned because of some witness drama. I'm not sure all of the details there, but it was something about witnesses, and he ended up not having to serve any prison time. Don't worry about Oliver North. He's fine. Today he is the current president of the National Rifle Association, the NRA. So if you ever see Oliver North on TV, this is really where he got his first major political moment. So Reagan sort of got off the hook on all of this, even though there were, of course, plenty of people who knew, yeah, he knew that things that weren't supposed to happen were going to happen, but it was definitely, I'm sure, the thought process of well, the ends justify the means. I'm still going to get to fund the group, the anti-communist group I want to fund, and I'm going to get the hostages back. So, who cares that I had to break the law in the process? And some people were okay with that, and some people weren't. But overall, the whole thing, sort of went away. The main scandal that has stayed with the Reagan administration, and the one major criticism that his administration gets to this day, is his handling of the AIDS crisis through the 1980s. So AIDS was first identified in 1981. But Reagan did not mention it publicly until 1985. So he went really almost his entire first term in office without one time mentioning what was a growing epidemic, and ultimately, more gay men in New York are going to die of AIDS during this period than all of the American deaths in Vietnam. This was not just people are, this is a new illness that we've just discovered and he's not talking about it. No, this was a major health crisis that the president was ignoring for 4 years. And so that was getting a lot of criticism. When he finally did mention it in 1985 in a press conference, it was really because he had been getting a lot of pressure from a lot of different sides. When he did talk about it, he expressed some skepticism when it came to allowing children with AIDS to attend school. This was really about one child in particular who had begun to make headlines. He had hemophilia and, had to get a blood transfusion. And when he got that blood transfusion, from the blood that he got, he contracted HIV, and which eventually morphed itself into AIDS. And he was not allowed to attend school. The parents in his community, basically saw him as a pariah, and for the health of their children, they demanded that he not be allowed in school. And so, and even though at the time this CDC, the Center for Disease Control, had said casual person-to-person contact with someone with AIDS is not at all a health threat, Reagan never said that. And at the time, realistically, how often do we hear about things that the CDC is saying? Right now, we're hearing plenty because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. But before all of this began, did you hear a lot of things from the CDC? No. And that doesn't mean they weren't saying things. It's just not really on people's radar. And for the most part, unless a major government official brings the CDC recommendations to people's attention, they don't know that. And so Reagan not talking about this made people think that, one, that the CDC's recommendation wasn't true, or that two, they just didn't know about it at all and they weren't aware of it. The Surgeon General under Reagan's administration, his name was Koop, K-O-O-P, Surgeon General Koop. He had several times requested permission to publish a report on the AIDS crisis, and Reagan's administration continuously denied that. Finally, in 1986, after more pressure from the community, he finally told Koop, okay, you can issue a report. What he wanted was a report that would basically toe the party line and calm the minds of Reagan's conservative and very evangelical voting and support base. That's not at all what Koop did. When he was allowed to finally speak, he spoke. And what he did was sent a informational packet about AIDS to every household in America. And in that informational packet included guidance about not being discriminatory against the gay community, and also proper condom use instructions. Of course, this is going to freak out and piss off a lot of Reagan's conservative supporters, and people who had, were really Reagan's group, were very not pleased with this. But the gay community, who had been trying to raise awareness about AIDS and get some real help in dealing with this crisis, was actually very happy. ACT UP, which was a group out of New York City, which was probably one of the most successful and well-known AIDS awareness activist groups, they were very critical of Reagan during this entire thing, and they started calling it AIDS Gate, producing material calling on for an investigation of Reagan and his handling of this, and trying to put pressure on the American people to demand something of him, or put pressure on him to act to prevent them from investigating him. And he did. In 1987, he finally put together a commission on AIDS called the Watkins Commission, and people in the LGBT community were really very skeptical at first of this Watkins Commission, because there were several people on the commission who didn't have any experience in dealing with AIDS, or the ones who were physicians were kind of not necessarily the ones that you might want. For example, there was a doctor on there who was against condom usage as a preventative measure. So there were a lot of people who were like, okay, yeah, he put together this commission, but they're not going to do anything that we want. But shockingly, the report that they published, they found a pleasant surprise, and it really did detail a lot of the thing. They made over 50 recommendations in this report. The main one being that they wanted a $20 billion AIDS fight over the next 10 years. And they put in there, if you think, if you're thinking $20 billion against this crisis is a lot, note that it is only 1/7 of the defense budget. So kind of sticking a dig in there, don't say that this is too much money when we're not at war with anyone, but we're spending 7 times this on defense. Ultimately, AIDS funding will increase from $44 million to $1.6 billion by the end of Reagan's presidency. So he did increase funding, but not to the extent, obviously, that the Watkins Commission asked. The other main recommendation that they made in their report was that there be some anti-discrimination policies put in place at the state and federal level. Not only to protect, children with AIDS, but the gay community, because so much fear about this disease had been created, and everything had been, it was originally called gay cancer, and then after that it was called GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, and because of that, everyone's thinking that it's just a gay disease. That was the quote, that's who gets it. But not necessarily. Everyone can get this. And in addition to that, there's a lot of fear about this. You don't see someone with cancer and think people are going to be like, ooh, don't come near me, it's contagious. But that's how people were acting like AIDS was, only that's not how you get it at all. And so it was basically just fueling the homophobia during the 1980s. And considering Reagan's base was such an evangelical and conservative group, they were definitely feeding into that. And in an effort to not piss that group of people off, Reagan didn't say really anything about the discrimination, anti-discrimination procedures that the committee wanted put in place, and ultimately really none of it will. Finally, in 1988, because a lot of people felt that when this report was released and Reagan took some steps that they still weren't enough. Congress, led by Representative Roy Rowland, who was the only doctor in Congress, and he was a Democrat from Georgia, he got Congress to pass a bill to create the National Commission on AIDS, which has pretty much existed ever since. Its name has changed a few times, but it still exists in some form to this day, because they felt that they needed to sort of take that fight into their own hands, because Reagan didn't really do it, and they didn't really feel like his successor, Bush Sr., would do it either. Okay, so finally, when we think about Reagan's presidency, most of the time when it comes up, people think about his Reaganomics, his main economic agenda, which was his domestic policy, and then his foreign policy, which was, I'm going to end the Cold War. That was what he set out to do. We're going to end the Cold War by any means necessary, however it has to happen. By the end of my presidency, we're going to be done with this. And pretty much he was successful at that. Reagan will bring it home here in a lot of ways. The first strategy was build up the military. This is going to be the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. We knew that the USSR could not afford to spend as much money on defense as we could. And so the strategy here is exploit that. Their communist government is extremely limited on funds. Our capitalist one has basically an endless line of credit with the rest of the world. So spend, spend, spend. And that took place in terms of personnel recruitment. That took place in terms of the arms race, weapons manufacturing, everything like this. Probably the most controversial of all of that, weapons buildup was something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or the SDI, which its critics called Star Wars, like the movie. But basically, it was a plan to put lasers in outer space. Space lasers. That was, the government's plan to defend us from communism. Space lasers, which I personally support. The goal was, or the thought process was, we've got all these satellites in space. Let's put some military grade lasers on them, and then if anyone tries to shoot a missile at us, we can shoot that missile out of the sky with our space lasers. Kind of a cool strategy, and it would have worked. The only problem is that in the 1980s, we had zero technology capable of making this happen. And it would have required a crazy amount of money to invest to create that technology with no like real knowledge that it really would have worked. So it doesn't pass. We don't have lasers in space that we know of, unfortunately. But when you vote for me in president in a decade or so, don't worry, I'll get you lasers in space. On top of this military buildup, the second strategy, the second way we're going to end this Cold War here is aiding those anti-communist groups. The Contras are one example, but there were others. We were aiding anti-communist groups, like I said, in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen in El Salvador, and Grenada is going to be also a really ends up kind of being famous and also not famous example of our anti-communist efforts. So Grenada is a very tiny island not far away from Cuba. It's got a sandals resort there. Now I encourage you to look it up on a map really quick so you can see how small Grenada really is. But we know that Cuba is led by Fidel Castro, communist dictator at the time, and Cuba was aiding leftist radicals to overthrow the prime minister of Grenada and institute a communist government. That's not something we want. So in 1983, U.S. troops will invade Grenada. This is kind of funny now, and a lot of people thought it was funny at the time, because the entire population of Grenada was 91,000 people. This is an island, a country smaller than Greensboro, and the U.S. Army will invade it to protect it from communism. It seemed like an overkill. Obviously, it was successful, and now a lot of government people and military uses the phrase "this is a Grenada" when it's like an easy win, when it's like a guaranteed, don't worry, that's going to be a win. So aiding those anti-communist groups all over the world is going to be our second strategy. And the third strategy is to develop a positive relationship with the Soviet Union when possible. And so in 1985, the Soviet Union will get a new leader named Mikhail Gorbachev. That's him there on the slide. No, his head is not bleeding. It's just a birthmark. So Gorbachev, like I said, took power in 1985, and between Khrushchev and Gorbachev, there were quite a few different Soviet leaders, but all of them were very short-lived, and none of them really necessarily got a lot done. So when we think about the main leaders of the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War, Stalin, Khrushchev, and Gorbachev are the three that come to mind. So Gorbachev was definitely looking to also end the Cold War himself, and he ended up sort of being perfect timing for us. He had these two new policies to put in place. The first was Glasnost, which is Glasnost, and in English that means a new openness. And who does he want to be open with? Us. He wants to be open with America. It's basically, wanting to enter an era of a more positive relationship with the United States, which is obviously something that we want. And then his other main agenda was something called Perestroika, Perestroika, which is essentially reforming the Soviet system of a state-controlled economy. It's economic reform and trying to not necessarily be capitalist, because that's not something they're ever going to admit that they want to do or that they would want to do, but it's definitely trying to scale back some of that, some of those communist economic agendas, because obviously it doesn't lead to economic growth, and we've seen that play out in the Soviet Union over the last, 50 years or so. The USSR was facing so many problems in the late 80s: food shortages, factories can't keep up with Western competition, their federal budget has been drained with this war that they're trying to fight in Afghanistan. So this is a good opportunity for us to make friends with Gorbachev and see this whole thing fizzle out. So Reagan and Gorbachev actually met 4 separate times during Reagan's second term when Gorbachev was in office. They even toasted each other at a state dinner. They went sightseeing around town one time. They just ended up being like, they seemed like they had a good personal relationship, that it wasn't just necessarily about politics. For either of them, that they genuinely got along. They started negotiations for a new treaty to end the arms race called the START I Treaty, which is essentially like a revamp of SALT II. And by this time, because of all those other, while we're working on this and trying to coax the Soviet Union into, liking us and doing what we want, at the same time, those other problems that they're having are affecting their foreign relations. Their lack of funding and their, food shortages and their, low manufacturing is starting to affect their ability to hold on to communism in the countries that they've been controlling for quite some time. So communism is finally starting to break down in that Eastern Bloc of countries in Europe. And in 1989, the Berlin Wall will finally come down. The Eastern German government had completely failed, and authorities finally opened up those gates. German citizens stormed through. You can see it in that photo right there underneath Gorbachev, and with sledgehammers, and physically broke large portions of the wall down. And a year later, in 1990, Germany was reunified in one country once more, and has been ever since. Around that same time, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary all began holding free elections, and by 1991, communism had lost in Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, and Yugoslavia. So pretty much by 1991, the only major communist power in Europe left was the Soviet Union, and that ended in 1991. In 1991, the Communist Party finally lost power in the Soviet Union, resulting in the end of the USSR. Russia will be split up into 15 independent republics, and they will be all under the umbrella of the Russian Federation, and that is the Russia that we know today. And it was going to be, led in this new era by a man named Boris Yeltsin. So unfortunately, Reagan wasn't president when that happened, so he couldn't sort of get all of the, glory. But by this time, George Bush Sr. was in his for, I guess, one and only term. He met with Boris Yeltsin, signed a promise of friendship between us and us and Russia, and that officially ended the Cold War. So even though it will be Bush who signs that final piece of paper, the fall of the war was overwhelmingly a combination of Reagan's strong policies, his heavy spending in the defense area, as well as Gorbachev's softening policies towards the United States and the rest of the Western world.